Thanks whoever's just recorded the meetings. Just to say, all of our sessions throughout the conference, except for the very first keynote, have been recorded. With Adobe Connect, you can make sure that participants don't actually appear in the recording, so don't worry, your chats and comments will remain anonymous. But yeah, with that, take it away, Joe.
Maybe we want to hear the chats and comments. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? I'm probably a bit loud, apparently. That is the tendency. Fabulous. Okay, so I'm Jo Buxton. I'm a research student at the OU in the IET, and I'm looking at making online live tutorials and group work more accessible for students with hearing loss and or sight impairment. I'm also an associate lecturer in STEM, and I'm a former distance student at the OU. I did my master's here. And I also have hearing loss myself and wearing hearing aids. So if I don't hear you, that's my excuse. Okay, so my research is focused on collaborative learning and synchronous online environments, live events like this and like tutorials and group sessions. And my research questions are, can we improve inclusivity in online distance collaborative learning for students with sensory impairments? And by that I mean hearing loss and or sight impairment. What are the barriers to engagement for collaborative activities, specifically in synchronous environments? And what interventions can we design that might improve inclusivity? So how can we reduce these barriers? What I'm reporting on now is some of the results from my research, and in particular, second research question, what are the barriers? The full research project involved both students and staff in the format of surveys, interviews and workshops to determine what the barriers were, and that was the studies, let me get the little drawing icon here, the studies 1 and 2 here. I am now in the process of using a focus group to discuss how to address these barriers with a view to producing a model based on those interventions. So this talk is about the outcomes from these first 2 studies. I'm using a mixed methods approach for this research, and I've used thematic and content analysis on the qualitative aspects of the survey and interview data, and then use some of the quantitative data from the surveys to test hypotheses arising from the thematic and content analysis, you know, such as students with hearing loss prefer face-to-face tutorials. I'm using a design-based research approach for the final phase, which will involve a collaborative, iterative process of designing and testing interventions to produce a model for accessible collaborative engagement, hopefully, with both practical and theoretical outcomes. So a bit more about the studies. A student questionnaire was trialled via the Disabled Students Group and then sent out to just over 1,000 students, a large proportion of whom had declared hearing and OU sight impairment. I had a good response from the email, so I've got 327 surveys. And as you can see, a large number of the deaf and hard of hearing students used lip reading, and some had BSL as their primary language. So it was quite a useful selection of students. Students were asked about both online and face-to-face tutorials. They were asked about forums and wikis and other group work with other students. So all kind of collaborative activities that they took part in. And each of these sections started with some closed dichotomous questions, you know, such as, have you attended an online tutorial at the OU? This was followed by some scale questions about experience. You know, I like to join in with discussions. I prefer to listen rather than talk during tutorials. And then some open questions for additional comments. You know, is there anything else you'd like to add about X, Y, Z? Finally, there was an About You section where they answered questions about their level of impairment, modes of communication, such as lip reading and BSL, and Braille, and use of assistive technologies such as screen readers. Interviews were conducted with both staff and students to get various different perspectives and to probe deeper in some of the issues that arose from the survey. So these were semi-structured interviews with students, staff tutors and associate lecturers, academic specialists and student support staff. I also ran a number of workshops with staff, both face-to-face and online, and then the combination of both. Some were cross-faculty, and I had staff in different roles in some and just associate lecturers in others. In the workshops, I used personas developed from the survey data and direct quotes from the students to stimulate the conversation. So, initial results, firstly from the student perspective, the survey and interviews. I have much more detailed categories, and there was a lot of technical issues, much of which was specific to the platform or equipment being used. The key areas where students were finding barriers to access were related to modes of communication, anxiety and stress, disengagement and opting out, pacing of participation control, and activity design and structure. There's overlaps in all the themes, and it was often a combination of these that stopped a student from participating. Lots of deaf and hard of hearing students had problems with reliance on the voice as the main mode of communication. They can't hear the tutor, can't lip read or use gesture, facial expression or body language to help, so they had a lot of difficulty following and joining in. A lot mentioned how much easier it was face-to-face with all the nuances that afforded. So perhaps we should be asking how we can replicate this in an online situation. Webcams are rarely used in the tutorials, for example, and technical problems can also slow this down, the communication or the quality of the image, which makes, using lip reading, etc., harder. I put some quotes on some of these slides. I'm not going to read through all of them, but feel free to read as you go. Anxiety and stress relating to participation and collaboration were really strong themes throughout. Specific to sensory impairment were anxiety and stress relating to mishearing or interpreting instructions and questions taken longer than was given to, read a screen or diagram or respond to a question. There were strong feelings of stress and anxiety, and also fear of appearing stupid. There was also anxiety around the need to disclose disability in order to communicate their needs and not wanting to make a fuss. Students often found tutorials mentally exhausting because if you're following a tutorial with a sensory impairment, it requires a lot more concentration than when you've got all your senses operating. That need for oops, I've lost the thingy. There we go. That need for self-advocacy and declaring need also contributed the problem of disengagement and opting out. Many of the students had actively chosen to opt out of tutorials and collaborative work at any kind of live events. And the reasons given were very varied, but many had a belief that these sessions were just not going to be accessible and were not for them, or they dipped in and found them so. And so they just didn't engage in the first place. There were also those that actually withdrew from modules when they discovered that there were collaborative aspects. And while we can't force students to collaborate, and I know a lot of students don't like to, I do feel we need to make sure that if they want to, they can, and make this known for them. So how do we do this is one of my questions. Again, students with sensory impairment mentioned taking longer to process and respond to communications, and this stems from both the practical and the cognitive considerations. For example, if you're reading a screen with a magnification, it takes longer because you've got to move around the screen than it would if you're just reading the full screen. Or if you're interpreting instructions with reduced hearing, you need time to construe and construct a meaning and then to comprehend it. And these delays, often mean that students miss out on contributing because the pace is often too fast for them. When multiple students talk at the same time, this is often really difficult for students to manage. And actually that's something that a lot of students with mental health problems or autism also mentioned from other studies. Some modules, oops, lost my little mouse, there you go. some modules required collaborative activities that are, were creating problems in themselves for the students, and they felt they weren't actually designed with accessibility in mind. And this often ended up with them having to do independent equivalencies, which is not really ideal. They were much, harder for the students to complete and actually engage with. And often, when they were in those group situations, because other students weren't necessarily aware of their needs, they felt that other students felt they were not pulling their weight because, they didn't realise what was going on. So you can see, there's a lot of things going on here, and there's a lot of overlap in these concepts, and it's often a combination of these factors that stop the students from engaging when they want to. So coming at it from the other side, the second part of my study was looking at it from the staff perspective, because obviously you need to get a handle from all angles. Tutors, staff tutors and student support obviously have to take a part to play in like recognising and reducing these barriers to engagement. We've got some staff with hearing loss or visual impairments themselves, and they've been very useful in contributing to this. But I interviewed and ran workshops with staff to see what ideas they had, what barriers they saw, and what adjustments they were made. So get from them what they'd tried that had worked, etc. I use materials from the student data to trigger discussion. You're not supposed to be able to read this, don't worry. These were in the face-to-face workshops. I printed out large sheets of quotes, stick in the middle of the table so they could be, people could sit round them and rotate them. And I also generated some personas, which I used in the online ones as well. And these were developed again from the survey data, and they're also all the quotes are from actual students, but they've obviously been mixed and anonymized, so I made up these new personas. What came out of the staff sessions were some adjustments and changes that can be made to try and reduce the barriers to engagement. So, linking up with what else has been said, there's the idea of pacing tutorials. Sorry, this has come out really small, which is one of the things I would not. Keeping in mind the extra time needed by some students. Leaving thinking time in reaction time. It's so tempting to fill any quiet space with talk. I know I do it all myself. I do it myself all the time. Controlling participation, so trying to avoid those situations where everyone's talking at the same time or one person's dominating the conversation. Describing slides as part of the narrative, so not necessarily going into great detail, but explaining the content so that a visually impaired student knows what's going on, or if you're talking through a diagram, saying things like just below that or just to the right as you go around. Providing materials in advance, getting screen readable slides or a PDF to students so that they can familiarise themselves with the material before they start, and then they'll know what you're talking about. Thing that I've used quite a lot is live transcription of salient points. So if you're doing it in Adobe Correct, having a text pane up and then, copying and pasting key points as you go through, so that there's another source of material. And, when you're designing activities, keeping accessibility in mind, there's a number of tools you can use for testing, but also, having a look at the UDL site for some guidance, Universal Design for Learning. Choosing colour schemes and font sizes, avoiding rearranging the Adobe Connect screen during the session, because if you're using a screen reader and suddenly all the panels have moved, it's incredibly difficult to follow. And, thinking about use of content generally, especially images and icons. And, preempting problems, in terms of, staff running tutorials, asking students beforehand what adjustments they need so that when they come to the tutorial, they know that they've been accommodated for. I know it's not always possible, but, these are things that came out of the staff study. And as I said, always more thoughts welcome. So if anybody's got any extra ideas, pass them on. In the next stage, well, the current stage of my research, I'm, just to give you a sort of brief overview, I'm trying to, I'm looking to sort of develop a model of engagement, focusing on the themes that came out of thematic analysis and the barriers that are produced. So modes of communication, controlling engagement and reducing stress, and designing and delivering activities in line with UDL principles. This is being developed by a focus group in an iterative process of design and evaluation. But key to the model is the concept of putting the control back in the hands of the students so that they can decide how they communicate. They can decide to what extent they engage or don't exchange, so that we make the environment as stress-free as possible. It's involving students and staff from the earlier phases, and there's a Moodle site as well with forums and models available for feedback between sessions. In each of the 4 sessions, which are spread out over a period of a month and a half, there'll be an introduction and re-evaluation of the model at the beginning of each session, and then looking at the next. They'll be all themed around one of the areas, and then coming back and adding to the model. So that's essentially it. Very, very brief run through, and not doing any of the things that I say you should do, like pacing and pausing, etc. Any questions?
As usual, I have some. I have some questions. Can I launch in with one right away?
Yep.
So if you go back to your slide where you listed out the barriers that you were interested in, you mentioned a few times that you were referencing the UDL guidelines, and it would be really interesting to know if this one here with the adjustments that have a bigger impact.
Oh, sorry, that one, yeah.
Have you?
I said the fonts come out really small on this one.
I was curious if you thought about how you might organize these adjustments along the dimensions in the UDL framework of access, building engagement, and internalizing engagement for students as a means of identifying if there are potential. You said like more. Sorry.
I know I can hear something in the background, but it's making me really difficult to work out what you're saying.
I'll also try and type this. It would be interesting to organize these along the UDL guidelines.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'm hoping that when I come to my model, it's going to, the theory is going to contribute to the UDL guide, use that kind of learning theory and UDL guidance as a framework. These are things that came specifically through an analysis of the stuff that came out of the workshops and interviews with staff. But there's some things that, I've been having debates with myself about, relying very much on UDL guidelines as well, because I think there are some problems with that. And one of the things, that has come out of this model is that the fact that there are so many different ways. Obviously, there's so many different ways of interacting, and that the principle of UDL is that everyone should be able to access in the ways that they and the means that they need to. But I'm very keen to get that access back in the hands of the student, so the student controls which ways they want to interact, particularly in the terms of mode of communication, so that they're given the choice of using subtitles or using lip reading or using things that they want to, and they can adjust the level at which each of those things take part in the environment. So I'm running the session. It'd be I've only just set up the group, but it'd be it'd be really interesting to see what comes out of this next phase, because I'm running in teams, a focus group for students, all of whom have either hearing impairments or sight impairments. So And the reason I've chosen both those groups is because obviously they can have a conflict between those requirements, and in order to facilitate the communication, we need to make sure that we're not increasing accessibility for one while decreasing the accessibility for another. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out.
Oh, thanks very much for that, Joe.
Question, but I think a lot of it's going to come in the next phase, really, because that's really where I start, implementing stuff.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear how that focus group goes. It's going to be interesting.
Sam was talking about school-age students. Most of the research about communication and collaboration for students with hearing or sight impairments is with school-age students. But a lot of it also focuses very much on profoundly deaf students or blind students. And one of the things that comes out of teaching with adults is that the level of hearing loss is a very broad range. So we've got students, and of course our students are adults, so some of them have acquired hearing loss and some of them have been born with hearing loss, and there's lots of different reasons for the hearing loss and different ways that and levels of hearing and communication, so it's quite a complex pattern. But there is quite a lot on school-age students, but most of it is on profoundly deaf or blind. Make sense?
All right.
Hence my gap in the market.
We have a question from Empine, has very politely.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Joe, for this very interesting presentation, and it's your doctoral studies. It's a very good doctoral study, I must say. And thank you very much. And as I was listening to you, all the things that you are raising here, I think it's something that we need to aspire to as curriculum designers or instructional designers or teachers even, because my belief is that we need to make things accessible for all students, because the ones that are higher, they will get there anyway. But the problem is that we go to the middle or even the higher student, and then we forget. We completely forget those that are below. And I was looking at this. I said, and for most students who are second language speakers, they need someone to slow down when they talk to them. They need to control participation, and in some instances, they even use their own languages to be able to take control of the conversation. But because in higher education, in South Africa in particular, it has to be English, and then they feel left out. And this disengagement, it's really across the board, even for those students who can read and write, however, because of the language barriers, because that's another issue that we need to address. And I think I'm really looking forward to what you are coming out in terms of designing, because if we're going to an online space, online itself, it removes certain people. It's a divide. It already sets people apart. Those who know how to get into an online, I call it a literacy of some sort, and those that are not able to get into an online space. And we leave behind a whole lot of people in the processes that we use things, because we tend to assume that we are moving along. And part of the problem is that tutorials as well have been they're based on face-to-face concepts. And when they go online, we take what we are used to in a face-to-face and put it in an online space. Even collaboration is based on that. So until such time when we develop or design.
And I think it's what you're saying is right, because the people that get excluded from these processes are the people that slip through the gap anyway, because that whole thing about opting out, they're opting out because it's not accessible for them. And that's going to be the same when it comes to language and when it comes to other issues as well. So that, and they're very easy to miss because we don't see them, because they've already opted out. And, that's one of the, I think, to be one of the hardest things to actually overcome. that makes sense.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to have to move us on to make sure the other presenters get their time. But I mean, as you can tell from the comments, it's a fascinating project, Joe, and I think
well,
we're
you know,
all
it's
really
one that's close to my heart.
to
Obviously, I wouldn't be here otherwise.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. Yes. Are you ready?
Can you hear me? Hey, hi everybody.
Yes, we can hear you.
There we go.
I don't know if you want to turn on your web, or if you'd rather do it without. Either is fine. Oh, I can see it.
Okay. So my name, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Beth. I am a third year PhD student in IET at the Open University. My research has been alongside the Oxford-based charity My Life, My Truth, who are a self-supported. I work specifically with the Banbury group. Lovely co-research tab. So, yeah, so what I'm going to talk about in this presentation, I'm going to do a brief introduction to the study.
Fantastic. Sorry to interrupt you, Jess. It's like I can hear from the same as Joe and Leslie, your sound is going out a little bit. I think it's just as you move your head with enthusiasm and your mouth goes a little bit further away from you.
Is that a bit better?
Very loud.
Oh, perfect. Cool. I think I selected the wrong mic on here. Oh, joyous. Right. So yeah, I'm going to start with an introduction to the study, discuss the different phases and how we did our research together. Next, I'm going to move on to the inclusive and creative research methods. They were really core to this study, so I think they deserve their own slide. And then I'm going to discuss the findings, moving on to the suggestions that we have as a group following on from our research. So, to start with, so this study was based on the research question, what support do people with learning disabilities require in regard to their capacity to engage with citizen science? So this came out of my literature review where I was reading a lot about citizen science, and prior to coming back to the OU as a PhD student, I'd been part of citizen science projects, I'd experienced them, I'd seen them, and one thing that I really found missing were certain communities. And from my previous experience working in a learning disabled charity and having discussions with them about the different things that I had done at school, that I'd done after school, it just wasn't something that they were aware of. They weren't involved in this dialogue. And that kind of threw up alarm bells for me. You know, this is a large community, and I struggled with the idea that they were being ignored, and I couldn't really work out why. So I wanted to do this study in an inclusive manner to include the community themselves in writing the new discourse and informing people on how they can work with this community. And the fact that, you know, they are so frequently branded as this hard to reach community, but in actual fact, is that true? And that's kind of where I started. So the study was split into 3 phases. The first phase focused mainly on setting the groundwork. So it was, you know, having open discussions about what consent is and how we as a group wanted to consent to this study. It was also about setting some ground rules. You know, how are we going to ensure that we each have an equal participation within this study? And then it was also about answering some key questions. So, you know, what was our relationship to research on a group level and also on an individual level? And what were our identities? You know, could we identify as researchers? You know I can because I'm a PhD researcher, but what about everyone else in the group? Did they feel like they were too pushed away from that, or could they actually have researcher as part of their identity? And then, so having done that, we moved on to our second phase, which was about planning and conducting our own citizen science study. So we did a lot of discussion around topic ideas and how we were going to do the research, and actually that was so interesting because, and I'm sure many people here will be as jealous as I was, we came up with our research study in about 15 minutes. And we, not only did we do that, we come up with the topic. We came up with the topic, who we were going to do it with, how we were going to do it. I know, 15 minutes, Mark, I know. It was absolutely astonishing. Their knowledge of research, without having been taught about it, they just knew what they knew what they wanted to do, basically. So the topic that we actually chose was how to look after our pets. So it was a really common thing within the group that we all had either our own pets or we had a connection to pets as well. So they wanted to know from the experts, how do you look after them? You know, they had some really key questions. So first aid on animals, you know, how do you tell if an animal has been poisoned? How are you supposed to feed them? What do you do with an animal who has anxiety? Really key questions for them. And so we collected all our data through a survey, which we sent out to local vets. No, Joe, the new kitten will not be making an appearance, unfortunately. Very sorry. But he, where was I? I got thrown off by new kitten. Yeah, so they collected their data through a survey to vets, thanks, Vicky. Which they then analysed all the data looking for commonalities. So they'd asked all these different questions, there were 10 questions, and they went through it and looked for the common threads for each question. And then they moved it from something which they actually identified as non-accessible. There was a lot of contradiction within the answers, there was a lot of big words that just weren't accessible to most people, to be honest, people outside the veterinary world, in fact. So what they did was they then put it into an easy read format, and we had started to put it into a leaflet that we were going to put into vets when the wonderful global pandemic hit. So that currently isn't finished. It's something that I don't feel comfortable doing on my own. It's not just mine, it's theirs. So it's something that we're going to have to wait to finish until we can all meet again. And then the final third phase of the study was due to be about evaluating our own capacities and discussing what we'd learned, how we might have changed, and whether we had any suggestions moving forward. Again, this was going to be a really creative couple of sessions. We were going to do a presentation in which we discussed our research, perhaps in a forum like this, you know, that it would have been great for them all to come to CALRG this year. But unfortunately, the global pandemic hit and that just wasn't an option anymore. So what we ended up doing was phone interviews, just where we had a really informal discussion about their experience and any suggestions they might have. So, moving on, like I said earlier, the inclusive and creative research methods in this study were key. This particular group of adults with learning disabilities had a wide range of different disabilities, and they also had a wide range of different literacies, so it was really important to me that they could all be involved. I didn't want to present an activity that, you know, only one person could be involved in. That's not inclusive in my mind. And in fact, just for those who might not know what inclusive research is, in particular with people with learning disabilities, I think Melanie Nin describes it best, in which she says that it's research with, not on or for. So that was a real important part of the study, that the research was in fact with them. They were my co-researchers and they led it alongside me. Obviously, as you have to do for a PhD, I had to make a plan in order to get through my first probationary year. But what I was very open to and what happened frequently was that plan changed. They changed it pretty much every session and led it to what they felt they needed, whether that was to get the project done or whether it was to just have a bit of space from the project. You know, there were sessions when we would have maybe 5 minutes working on the project, and then we would just chill out and discuss things, which often led to really interesting discussions which related to the research. Yeah, the creative methods in this project. I've got here 3 different examples. So the shoeboxes that you can see are part of the identity box exercise. So all I asked them to do was to create their identity as a citizen in these shoeboxes. Now that's a massive task, and I just gave them a shoebox each and some stickers, some magazines, some newspapers. But what came out with it was phenomenal. You know, they really focused on their personalities. They focused on their likes and dislikes. What wasn't there was their disability. It wasn't a key part of their identity. In fact, to them it was more important about showing that they were positive, that they had inner strength, that they were a smiley person. And that, I felt, was really interesting when going into this study, because for them the learning disabilities wasn't as important as everything else in their world. The middle picture you can see is an example of the collage yourself activity. So here I just asked them a very simple question: what does research mean to me? And every single person came up with something different. However, there were some really interesting common links. So they all focused on a topic that was interesting to them. You know, so I actually piloted this with some of the other PhD students, and their focus was mainly on the research process or on their own opinions of research, their own experiences of research, but this group focused solely on topics. So here you can see the topic about NHS. That was something that impacted them largely, and specifically in the local community as well, as they are currently looking at shutting down the local hospital. So it was a real focus of the different topics that affected not only them, but also other communities. You know, they were advocating for children, for the elderly, for other forms of disabilities. They were looking at animals. They were looking at hate crime. There was a really broad range of topics. And what was also really interesting was how they identified different aims of research. So here you can see the really clear aim is help. But they identified that the research was about helping, stopping, and improving, which I think is just a wonderful way of looking at research, focusing on the impact that it can have on those local communities to them. I think was just great, and it clearly showed what was really important to them. So, the findings from this study. So we've focused on talking about the process of the study, which I think was really important and actually a really key part of my PhD. The findings, however, so when I went into analysing this, I used thematic analysis, and there were 2 key themes that came out: capacity and support. Now, they did largely come from my literature review and my research questions, but I want to discuss in more detail the different things I found under each heading. So for capacity, the co-researchers displayed so many different capacities to do research. A large impact of that was their prior experience of knowledge. So they would use their experience within their community to impact on their capacity to do research and their capacity to engage with citizen science as well. Oh God, that was terrifying. I'm not sure if that happened to anyone else, but my face just became gigantic on the screen. And prior experience and knowledge. And also personal relevance was really key to them. So that was what motivated them to engage. And it was actually something I found quite often, that if they weren't necessarily interested in the topic we were discussing, then they wouldn't engage as much. They might start reading a newspaper. They might start taking photos of the outside. They might nip to the shop and never come back. And that for me was a massive finding, in that when we're doing citizen science studies and you can look at the literature on the motivations of citizen science, personal relevance is a massive thing. And I think it's interesting to look at it within this community, because they have different interests and there are things that have a different relevance to them. And by actively acknowledging that, perhaps we can engage this whole community much better in citizen science. And then moving on to support. So one thing I wanted to look at specifically in this study was whether there was a large amount of support needed in order to encourage this community to engage, or whether there wasn't, quite simply. And what I found really interesting was a large amount of the support came from the co-researchers themselves. So it was the group dynamic that we created, largely through this inclusive approach, but that they were able to support each other. You know, we all acknowledged that we came into this with different skill sets. There were certain co-researchers who had never used a computer before, and then there were others who were really adept at using a computer. And instead of having to have a non-disabled researcher come in and do that, they were perfectly capable of supporting each other, which was really important, and I think shows that perhaps we do need to reevaluate with citizen science, because I think largely when you are a citizen scientist, perhaps you're engaging in Galaxy Zoo or you are doing something on Enquire, it's largely a lone activity, but perhaps by looking at it as a more group dynamic and looking at how we can engage people in whole groups rather than on their own, we can start to bring in these communities that have previously been forgotten about. Yeah, and finally, I'm speeding through this, I know. Finally, I wanted to talk about the suggestions from this study. So I haven't really gotten to that bit yet. I think because I've not been able to have these discussions with my co-researchers, I'm finding it a bit hard to come up with solid suggestions. But I did want to share with you some suggestions that my co-researchers had when I asked them the question in the phone interviews, you know, if you had any advice for people wanting to conduct this sort of research with people with learning disabilities. And the key thing here was just help them, talk to them, you know, listen to what this community has to say. It's important. And change the way that we work, because just because we've done it one way the whole time, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily the right way. And if we are losing an entire community because of the way we're doing it, perhaps it's not the right way to do it. And I absolutely loved the phrase, just give it a go. What have you got to lose? Give it a go, because you never know what's going to come out of it. And I know personally, I have had the most phenomenal experience working with this group. And I also just wanted to share some feedback that I got from the group leader, who has been working with all the members of this self-advocacy group for 10 years now. And she said, going forward, I really do hope that this study furthers the important cause of true and proper inclusivity of people with learning disabilities in research. And I think that's key. That's going to be a really key takeaway from this, is that there is so much more research to be done, and there is so much more work that can be done. And it's our responsibility to lead the way and to allow a space for people with learning disabilities to speak up. And at the moment, I feel that this is more important than ever, because as we're moving into a phase where there's going to be a lot of research being done on the global pandemic and the effects that it's had on communities, this community in particular has been incredibly badly hit. You know, the learning, I believe, in the so March to April, there was a 135% increase in deaths of adults with learning disabilities in this country. Yet it's not really, you don't see that much in the news. I think I've seen one segment on it. And we as researchers need to make sure that we are allowing the space for this community now to speak up and to have their voices heard in research. So yeah, sorry about that massive thing at the end. As you can tell, it's something that I'm quite passionate and quite angry about at the moment, that it's not necessarily being heard. But that is it. Does anybody have any questions?
I feel like we maybe almost shouldn't have questions. It was such a rousing call to action at the end from you. It's almost a pity
Thank you.
to end then. But wonderful, wonderful stuff. Yes. Does anyone have any questions? I think we have time for one, two. Before it was. Really
I'd just like to say, Quan, I'm more than happy if you'd back me. I'll go for Prime Minister.
I mean, you'd be a sight better, and no political commentary maybe during CALRG. Yes, does anybody have any questions?
Please do feel free to go back to the research.
No questions, Jess, but just to make you aware that I think you're terribly inspiring, and I love what you're doing, and I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think it is as well, and I think it's an important thing that we start to move towards this. You know, actually, public engagement strategies have really started to come through, and now there is a big focus on engaging underrepresented communities. So it's something that's coming into this field massively, and we just need to kind of pick up the baton and go.
And I think more public knowledge needs to be known about what's happened during lockdown. I mean, I've heard very similar things from a friend who works for MenCap and works with adults with learning disabilities as well. She's shocked by what's gone on.
I mean, it is heartbreaking. I've been volunteering with My Life, My Choice. I have 3 or 4 phone calls a day with some adults with learning disabilities, and it's hard. It's a lot harder when you are stuck in somewhere that you can't escape, and some of them don't necessarily understand why, and that's incredibly hard for them. And then at the same time, you know, I think it's 1 in 4 adults with learning disabilities live in a care home. The other 3 out of those 4 tend to live in supported living environments, and actually supported living environments aren't getting the same things as care homes are at the moment. So they're still not allowed testing in the same way that care homes are. So those 3 out of 4 people with learning disabilities are again being ignored, and it's a hard time at the moment, and it needs to be spoken about a lot more.
Yeah.
I think with that we'll move to our final presentation. But yeah.
Thank you very much.
Joe and Jess, I mean, you've given us a lot to think about, I think, about what we do in terms of engaging with these slightly marginalized communities and making sure that they actually have a voice that's heard, and it's not just systems that actually are adapted to the majority.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, everyone.
Very much. Okay, and we come on to the final presentation of not only the Doctoral Consortium, but CALRG 2020. Please don't all rush off after Jake has finished speaking, as Garron and Quan, as discussants, will give some thoughts and perhaps some advice. I think Paco mentioned at the start of Doctoral Consortium 1, but Garron and Quan are definitely 2 success stories that have come from the Open University's PhD students, both going off to very highly reputed universities in the US and doing fantastic research now. So I can't wait to hear what they have to say. But before that, Jake, are you ready?
I think so. Oh. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yes.
Excellent stuff. Okay. I'd just like to say thank you very much for coming to listen to my presentation. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about a certain part of my PhD research, which is going to look at tutors' understanding of students' emotional experiences in online group activities. And my supervisors at the OU are Karen Kerr, Helen Donlan and Caroline Heaney. Okay, so to start with, I'll just give a brief background to this study. So in online online learning environments or distance learning environments, the use of collaborative learning activities is becoming increasingly more prevalent. These activities try to encourage active learning and equip students with skills that will be important for employment, such as teamwork skills. For instance, at the Open University itself, the UK Open University, there are quite a lot of learning activities and assessments which are linked to interaction and collaboration between students. And over the last couple of decades, recent research is kind of increasingly highlighting the impact of emotions and emotional experiences in kind of learning, and how emotions can impact things like motivation, choice of learning strategies, memory storage, and ultimately their students' learning and achievement in academic learning environments. Also, although much of this research has been undertaken in kind of person-to-person or face-to-face settings, there's been increasingly more research done in online and social and collaborative online learning environments over maybe the last 5 or 10 years. However, despite kind of these recent advances, there's still kind of a lack of research that investigates how tutors perceive students' emotions in kind of these online learning situations. And gaining such perspective would not only allow for kind of a comparison between students' perspectives and as well as the tutors, but it also help explore the challenges tutors face when they're trying to understand what students are feeling and their emotions they're experiencing when they're learning in social online learning environments.
It seems that Jake has just crashed out of Adobe Connect. He's just re-entered, so let's set him back up. Jake, you're back with us, and I just gave you presenter status. Not sure what's happening. I mean, Adobe Connect has done quite well to get to the end of 2 days without accidentally kicking out a presenter. I guess this is maybe its last flourish before we end the conference.
I think it's my internet. Can you hear me again?
Yeah, you're coming through loud now.
Yeah, did you kind of just hear up to the last bullet point on my slide, or I don't know where I got to? Yeah. Okay, I'll just keep going from where I was. Yeah. So yeah, I was just kind of stating that kind of having that tutor's understanding students' emotions is important in these online and in kind of any learning environments, and kind of that you know, high quality teaching and learning depends on kind of that emotional understanding between teachers and students. So for instance, in kind of online learning, you've got models like the community of inquiry, which kind of emphasize the importance of social and more recently emotional presences, and kind of how they're important for high quality teaching and learning. Okay, so this study aimed to explore tutors' perspectives, like I said, of students' emotional experiences. And there were 2 main research questions which I tried to explore. So first one, I wanted to see what emotion-related words tutors use to describe students' emotional experiences. Also then wanted to kind of look at more of a qualitative exploration of how tutors, understand and describe these experiences when they kind of tutor on these type of activities. Okay, so the study context itself. The study context was at the UK Open University. I used 5 OU modules that kind of have a collaborative activity included in them, which links to some type of assessment. So in each of these modules, students had to work together in small groups to create some type of product, which again, they kind of get assessed on, which will count towards their overall grade for the module. In each of these activities, students could communicate with one another using different technologies, but primarily through asynchronous communication. So they were all given an online discussion forum to communicate with the rest of their team, but they could also go away and use synchronous technologies such as video conferencing and other things they wanted to do kind of individually in their own group. So I collected data from 2 different methods. So the first method was intentionally created online discussion forums. So online discussion threads were kind of set up in the tutor forums of 3 of the 5 different modules I looked at. The 2 modules I didn't set it up in, I didn't get module chair permission to do it, so I kind of had to do it in 3 modules. And from those, there were 7 participants from the S294 cell biology module, and then from the T215 module in communication information technologies, 5 tutors commented on the forum thread. The TD223 module, can't remember the exact module title, no tutors commented on the forum thread. I think probably the low participation rate between tutors is because, you know, the tutors at the OU are part-time, they've got a lot of other responsibilities, and they're not contracted to take part in any research, so that might have had a large impact on kind of tutors taking part in these online forum discussions. The forums themselves, so there were kind of 3 threads set up. One looked at kind of the emotions they thought students experienced, as well as the causes and kind of what impact they had on the students' participation and performance in the activities. The second thread looked at how tutors try to monitor and manage these kind of emotions students might experience. And then the third thread related to kind of what tutors thought might make a more positive and supportive learning environment for students in these learning contexts. The second method used to collect data was qualitative telephone interviews, and they were all semi-structured. And from the 5 modules, I had 16 participants volunteer to take part. 10 of the participants were female and 6 were male, and as you can see on the diagram on the screen, or table on the screen, sorry, they had different levels of experience teaching or facilitating these types of activities. So there were quite a few students who had quite substantial experience, and then a few with kind of less experience doing these types of activities. Oops, sorry. And then the interview questions largely related to kind of similar themes that were in the online discussion forums about the emotions they thought students experienced, kind of how students might express their emotions, and kind of creating these positive learning environments. Okay, so I've only just started analysing a lot of this data, so it's not fully complete, but I'll just kind of run through what I've done. So in for the first research question, looking at these emotion-related words tutors use, I looked at both the online discussion forum threads and data from the interviews themselves. And as you can see on the word cloud on the screen, there were, in total, there were 455 emotion-related words that were mentioned kind of in these 2 different data sets. And kind of these words related to 55 emotion-related categories. So for instance, if a tutor said a student were anxious or one student had anxiety, then they were just grouped under kind of an emotion-related category of anxiety. So out of the 55 categories that were mentioned, 24 related to more pleasant emotions, and then 30 related to more kind of unpleasant feelings, and 1 was kind of surprise, which kind of students the tutors related to as both positive and negative, so it's kind of uncategorized. From these, the 3 most related emotion-related categories mentioned by the tutors were anxiety, worry, and frustration. And in overall, the tutors mentioned a lot more kind of like these unpleasant negative emotions that students experience in these environments. However, kind of compared to research I've done with the students, where, you know, it's kind of a bit more of a 50-50 split about pleasant and unpleasant emotions, tutors kind of largely emphasize more of these future-orientated unpleasant emotions such as anxiety, nervousness, and worry. And they kind of there was kind of a bit of a difference between students and tutor perspectives, as tutors kind of didn't mention maybe the future-orientated pleasant emotions such as curiosity and excitement as much as students did. Also, the tutors didn't mention the emotion of relief, which was mentioned really highly by students in all of the studies that I've done. However, that might just be because, you know, students don't try and express those emotions as much as they would if it was more of an unpleasant emotion that maybe if they were experiencing anxiety, they'd reach out to their tutor. Okay, so some of the data I'm kind of analysing at the moment, so for this second research question of this study, was looking at kind of how do students understand these emotional experiences. And I've started undertaking a thematic analysis of all of the qualitative data that I collected. And there's been 3 main themes that have kind of arrived. First, so tutors describe these diverse emotional experiences by students. So, you know, they explain that there's quite big individual differences, and they mention things like more confident and less confident students. They talk about different personality types. They talk about how mental health issues can have an impact when there's these social activities, and the maturity and experience of students when they undertake maybe experience of working with others. They seem to feel it has some impact on kind of their experiences in these environments. And also the additional levels of commitment some students have to have when they undertake these type of activities, where maybe their control of what they're doing is a little bit less than kind of the individual based assignments, which a lot of OBU students are kind of used to. Looking at that, tutors also discussed about how group members and group formation had an impact on these students' emotional experiences. So it could be that there's active and engaged students, and those group members might experience more pleasant feelings, whereas if there's a group of disengaged students that are non-active, that might lead to more unpleasant feelings. And they also discussed dominant group members a lot, so how a dominant group member can cause the group to maybe have more of an unpleasant experience, or on the other extreme, a more pleasant experience. And they also highlighted how kind of these emotions from the dominant members could be transmitted to the other group members and kind of impact their own emotions. Another thing that's come through is this change in emotions. So nearly all of the tutors mentioned that students had probably more of a pleasant experience near the end or after the activity is completed than at the start. And that's something that's kind of come through a lot of my research related to these activities. And then also about the impact. So the impacts of negative emotions. A lot of the tutors mentioned that they thought it wasn't necessarily a bad thing that students experienced unpleasant emotions, because a lot of students said tutors stated that learning isn't supposed to be easy and learning can be hard, and you kind of benefit from those experiences. However, obviously, if they did recognise that if students were experiencing these unpleasant emotions that were quite long and persistent, then they would definitely need the kind of support. Otherwise, it could have an impact whether they withdraw or disengage from the activity itself. So kind of the second thing that's coming through is kind of this emotional awareness and expression. Tutors discussed the difficulty of understanding students' emotions. They said, they're kind of limited to certain ways of understanding it. And if students don't communicate at all, then it's impossible to understand how they're feeling. So it's, for instance, it might be predominantly through the online collaborative forums. So tutors will monitor those forums to see how students are feeling. They might also look at retrospective feedback that's usually on the assignment. So for most assignments using these group activities, they will have some type of feedback to say, how was it working in the team? How did you find it? So that's another way, but obviously that's after the activity is completed. They said they understood tutors' more negative emotions primarily through one-to-one telephone phone calls or communication, maybe emails. And they knew that if students did have a problem, that's when they would reach out to them most often. And then there was talks about the differences between how, in a person-to-person environment, which in a lot of the modules I looked at didn't seem to have many of those experiences. I think those might have been kind of reduced from the module, and how you could really see how somebody was feeling and you could talk to them about it, but in the online environments, it's very different. Tutors also mentioned about how easy it was for students to mask and suppress feelings. And, that might not have been a bad thing, because, if you're in a group, you might have wanted to suppress certain emotions to make sure that the group was functioning instead of maybe having an argument with somebody. So they said in the online environment, that's kind of quite easy to do than maybe compared to a person-to-person environment. And then again, they talked about this emotion transmission. So they highlighted that as a tutor, it is important for them to be positive about it, about the group activities, because sometimes these students come into these activities with quite a negative frame of mind. I think, a number of tutors mentioned that a lot of students will read stuff on open forums about the negative experiences, but, actually after they do the activity, it's quite a positive one, but they've come into it quite negative. And then the last kind of theme that's emerging is the role of the tutor. So tutors talked about how important it was for them to kind of be used as a support mechanism, or for students to regulate their emotions. So So, you know, when students could contact them, or if tutors will contact the students to help support and regulate and kind of try and help change their feelings and emotions. Also, it's important for tutors to try and create this supportive emotional climate in groups, and kind of that monitoring and managing is important. Obviously, that was quite different between tutors, and I need to look at that a little bit more. The group formation, tutors talked a little bit about the difficulty about how to assign students to groups and what the best ways of doing that is, because they know they could put groups together which might have a better experience, but then that might lead other groups to have more of a negative experience depending on the level of engagement and whether they think students will participate in the activity. And again, they talked about this transmission. You know, tutors feel like it might have been quite important to try and be quite positive, maybe not over positive, but be a positive and supportive way of looking at the group project, instead of, you know, just looking at it and going, oh, we just need to get through this activity and then you can get back to your own individual study. So just quickly, last couple of slides. So implications and future research. I think, you know, it seems that tutors would be like to understand students' emotions a little bit clearer. You know, they can get a picture of it, but sometimes it can be very difficult. So things that could help tutors understand the students' emotions might be quite beneficial. So me and my supervisors in the last academic year used kind of emotion awareness and regulation tool in one of the collaborative activities, using real-time student feedback, and that's maybe something which could be developed a bit further to see how useful the tutors found that, because we just looked at the student data at the moment. So if we maybe do it next year and look at what the tutors find, or if they find it beneficial to look at this information and exactly what they can do with it and how they can support students. You know, I've been reading more about kind of how, you know, AI and other types of technologies could be used for this type of thing as well. So further research on tutors' perspectives will help provide a more complete picture of students' emotional experiences. Obviously, I'm just looking at this one aspect of a group activity, but it might be expanded more to the whole online learning environment at the Open University. And then findings from such research can be used to help create a more positive and supportive learning environments for students when undertaking the collaborative activities, which obviously is kind of the main purpose of what I'd want to do with my research. Okay, so hopefully you can still hear me. Some message just popped up on my screen, but thank you very much for listening. And if you've got any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jake. That was a really interesting study. Do we have any questions from the audience? I have a feeling Garron, at the very least, will have some questions for you. Those who don't know Garron, his PhD was about emotions and whether you can, I guess, automatically detect it through analyzing students' chats.
Yeah, I obviously have questions, but I was also curious if there are others that wanted to speak. I'm furiously typing notes in the document for Jake right now. In a good way, in a good way. If not, I'll go ahead and jump in. So you mentioned a few things. There's a few points. So I'm really curious about two dimensions, and I want to have follow-up conversation with you on both of those dimensions. One is around the trajectories, or what you talked about in terms of the emotional shift that students are experiencing through the conversation. And I was curious if you were thinking about, in the categories you highlight, anxiety, frustration as dominant data. There's some existing research that show trajectories that lead to those states. One of which is sort of sustained uncertainty and sustained confusion. And I found it really fascinating that you mentioned, you know, sustained frustration, that some frustration is probably good, but sustained frustration might be bad. And so I'm curious if, like, maybe there's something along the lines of looking at this trajectory perspective from, like, an emotional stagnation, and if there's any evidence in the data that you're looking at where that might be part of what is maybe challenging in emotional experiences when people are unable to make those transitions. Out of states, and maybe some transitions or some states of emotions are maybe more problematic in terms of getting into a stagnation. That would be really fascinating to try to see if there's evidence of that in the data that you've collected. Can you give me an initial reaction to that query?
Yeah, definitely. I think the kind of the change is very interesting, and because I've looked at quite a lot of these group activities, there seems to be for the assessed activity, because obviously the different context. When we looked at non-assessed group activities, the emotions were very different. Yeah, there seems to be this kind of the dominant emotion seems to be very much anxiety and kind of future orientated kind of uncertainty, and then it does. The most dominant emotion during the activity definitely is frustration, and then after is this relief. So there definitely seems to be some kind of link there. With kind of the sustained frustration, a lot of these emotions are kind of very socially related, and a lot of the anxieties and frustrations are just around whether they think people are going to take part, or when they do take part, there's then that relief. So this relief popped out quite a lot. Even in kind of during the activity, we thought it might come out a lot after the activity, but yeah, there was this relief. That, somebody's actually engaged with me, somebody's taken part, and that very much related to the anxiety they were experiencing, and kind of regulating their emotions. And kind of, I think the students being able to experience the relief might have been quite beneficial to them.
Yeah, the relief seems to tie into to some of the existing literature on facial expressions of emotions, in that some emotional expressions on the face, like furrowing the brow, is really an indicative of some event is about to take place, where I furrow my brow and then maybe I raise my eyebrows because I realize, or I furrow my brow and then that was so frustrating that I do some aversion strategy, like looking down and away. And so like the notion that there's these trajectories in play where these states are maybe negative experiences, but possibly related to productive processes, I think is really fascinating. And I think that the more that you can sort of identify those distinctions within this data, the more that it can connect and help other people understand what you're saying about negative emotions as being productive.
Thank you. Definitely need to dig into that a little bit more. Try and understand it a little bit better.
And then there's just the last thought really quick. You talked about tutors, I'm sorry, I can't hold myself back. You talked about tutors socially regulating emotions of students. And I was curious if you've done any work in thinking about looking at some frameworks of social regulation strategies and mapping tutor behaviors to those frameworks to better understand to what extent this is like an intuitive social process that tutors are doing, or whether to what extent it's some sort of a skill that you might be able to sort of quantify and describe in a framework perspective.
Yeah, I haven't done that yet with the tutors' perspectives. We've looked at a lot of the students and how kind of their emotion regulation strategies and their emotion regulation goals, and obviously using tutors for support is one of them. But I haven't really delved into the tutors' perspectives that much, because obviously that's kind of only a little bit. But that would be very interesting to see, like you said, if they are doing that on purpose and why they're doing that. Maybe some other research might have to look at that later.
All right, I think this is I have the feeling, Jake and Garron, you could go back and forth on some of the aspects of this for a long time, but we're unfortunately officially already 5 minutes over the schedule of the conference. But we definitely have time to hear a little bit from Garron and Quan. So Garron, would you like to say a couple of words just about, I mean, it's been a while since you were at the OU, and obviously a lot of the research for the PhD students has come on quite a bit since then. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that, and also what life has been like for you since you left.
Great, sure. Yeah, so first off, thank you so much for inviting me to come today, because this is like, oh, I missed the CALRG meetings. So definitely like enjoy the experiences that you're having at the OU while you're there. It's a fantastic place. And there are many aspects that I do miss about being in the OU research community. Again, just thanks for inviting me today. And then, like you said, it was really fascinating to sort of like have been away for a bit and then come back and look at the progress that the students have been doing with their research, and it's fantastic. Like, it's great to sort of like, I feel like that all this stuff has been progressing, and it's been really, really interesting to see the way that it's taking shape and developing. I think that like one of the things that came up frequently or like we said, the COVID was the non-named member of the conference. I think that that's something to be thoughtful about as you're sort of transitioning into maybe job search mode. That there are so many universities that are really scrambling to respond to unprecedented situation in the current context. And online learning is a part of that puzzle, and nearly every presentation that we saw is really addressing dimensions from an OU perspective, where it's like, we really want to focus on the pedagogical implications, how online learning supports learning, and how are we doing more and extending beyond, and not just trying to replicate a face-to-face interaction, but really understand the differences. And so I think that as every student in here is going through their interview processes and looking on the job market, there's a very compelling story out of the OU in terms of the depth of experience and expertise that the institution has in taking that kind of focus. And every one of your projects and every one of these presentations reflects that. And so as all of these universities are looking to figure out how they're going to do fully online delivery, they need folks like the students that are coming out of the OU to help them achieve those goals. So that would be my reaction to the work that's going on and the presentations that I saw. And then I'll gently remind you that I think I saw a diagram about the distinction between doing your PhD and doing a postdoc, where the diagram of the doing your PhD is like your entire head is on fire. It's all red. And I would say, yeah, I totally remember that level of pain. And then I think a postdoc is like when your entire body is on fire. And so I think that there's challenges ahead. And I can speak to that. Like the level of effort and the amount of demand on time across multiple projects and initiatives. It's really hard. And it's one of those things where I think that when you look at postdoc type roles, what you want to look at specifically is looking for communities again. And so again, I think that at the OU, I had a very strong community experience of support amongst the PhD students. And I think that as you go to institutions, if you think about the postdoc roles, having support amongst postdocs is a very parallel experience to that. And so one of the things that has come up in some of postdoc conversations that I've had is this notion that that basically there's sometimes you don't feel like you have the same time and luxury in the postdoc to do the same thorough job that you know you have a capacity to do. And part of that is because you've gone through rigorous development of skills within your PhD such that you've got some muscle memory to sort of do things as effectively as you can in under tighter circumstances. So I think that there's a lot to take on as you transition, but I think that I'm thinking that that there's definitely a way to navigate those waters, and they're very similar to how you navigate a PhD process. That's sort of some of the advice that I have. Now, at the same time, yeah, some people are saying I'm a little bit too negative about the postdoc. The opportunities there is fantastic. So like the types of conversations and the types of projects that you get exposure and opportunity to participate on are phenomenal. So one of the things that I'm currently doing is preparing teachers that teach computer science to create more equitable classrooms. And I'm actually working with 12 fellows across the entire U.S., so it's like 9 different states represented, tackling all of these tricky and difficult conversations that folks can have around issues of like gender and race. And I get to provide support in thinking about how emotional measures might support people to have better productive conversations when, say, a student calls a teacher racist, and how might a teacher respond to that. And so the idea that I'm actually getting a chance to support that across the entire country, like every region in the country is participating in the study, feels really important and impactful, particularly in the contemporary challenges that we're facing in the U.S. and globally around issues of racism. So the opportunity and the impact that you can have is fantastic, and at the same time, the level of work, I think it ratchets up a bit, and so I think that that's the other piece of advice that I have, is that when you're looking for that next opportunity, finding an opportunity where you can have some deep, meaningful connection to the kind of work that you want to be doing, because you really, I think, need to have that level of intrinsic motivation to navigate through the high demand of what that work will look like.
All right, thank you very much, Garron. Some also inspiring words, I think. It's definitely, I think a lot of what you're talking about actually is not just postdocs, but a career in academia. Interesting challenges that you can have a real impact on, but it's you're tough. You have to put in a lot of hours. But it's good people know this when they're thinking about what to do next. Quan, your microphone was a little bit quiet earlier, but would you like to?
Can you hear me now? I hope it's better. Is it?
I can hear you. You're definitely a lot quieter than Garron. Let me turn up my speakers and see if that helps. Okay. Can you speak again? I can hear you.
Okay, I think something is
Quan, I have
something is wrong.
Coming through much clearer now for some reason. So.
So just to echo on what Garron has said, I also really had a great, fantastic PhD experience at the OU with Denise and Bart, and also the community was fantastic. So people outside of my supervision team was also very helpful and supportive, like Rebecca, and also the friends and the colleagues are also fantastic as well. So I think just to reflect on all the presentations today, I think, as Garron said, we at the OU has a very unique strength in terms of online blended learning research and also inclusive and open and for learner disabilities. So I think that's a great selling point moving forward when we move to the job market. I think one of the things that I would like to stress is, so now that you guys have done fantastic work, you guys have published, but then there's also a process of making your research visible to the people that in your academic communities, but also a wider, broader set of audience. Because a lot of research published every year, so in the journal, I think there's hundreds of papers published every year. So it's hard for your research to be visible if you don't promote it yourself. So I think in a way, I think one of the lessons that I've learned is everyone is doing great research, but not everyone is doing a great marketing job of their research. So I think we should be more attentive to make our research more publishable, or no, more public, like tweet on Twitters and invite yourself to a group, a discussion, and so on. So just to reflect on my postdoc experience, I think my experience is postdoc is another PhD, but just with a shorter time spent, and you have pressure to bring in money. But I think I really enjoyed the postdoc experience, and but also I think there are a lot of choices and options, and not necessarily the only option is a postdoc. So so I think you should consider to both the path of doing a postdoc or doing something in the industry, which is also a great options, I think. So yeah, just keep your options open, and I think yeah, postdoc is great, but also it's not something if you don't enjoy the culture in academia. So I know, you've been doing this for a while, so you know what the culture is like. So it's not always have to be in academia if you don't enjoy this process. But anyway, I think that's my thoughts. So I'm very glad to catch up with you guys, and I'm very proud of all the work that you guys have done. I think some of you I have, talked with you guys from the first year, so I know and I understand you're struggling getting participants and analysis and so on. So you guys have come a long way, and you should be very proud of your work. And I wish you the best of luck finishing your research. Peace.
Thank you so much, Quan. I'm sure everyone at home is. I really wish there was some kind of clapping emoticon. But yeah, thank you so much for your thoughtful comments and questions, Garron and Quan. I can see there's been a lot of activity in the Google Docs, so we'll make sure that everybody who participated in the Doctoral Consortium gets to see that. This brings us to a close of the CALRG conference. I'm going to pass you over to Anne Jones for the final couple of words of goodbye. But from my perspective, thank you so much, everyone. It's been, I think, I really related to what Jake was saying about tutors being worried about people turning up when you put on.
Brilliant. Okay, can you hear me okay? And thanks very much, Vicky, and great to see Quan and Garron there. In fact, I've just had some figures in now, and we had 99 people sign up. So I don't know if it's still open, but if you can get into Eventbrite, you might just sign your cat up and make it around 100, but that would be cheating a bit, wouldn't it? So I'm Anne Jones, as probably most of you know. If you don't, that's me, and I'm an academic in IET and have been in the CAL group for all its existence. Gosh, that makes me feel old. So I just wanted to say a few things and won't keep you long because I thought it was just worth rounding up a little bit. As we've said before, this is our first online conference and we're really pleased with how it's gone. Not surprisingly, there are things to learn from it as well. It's mainly worked well, though we've had the odd hitch. But the consequences have been interesting because we've thrown it open and it's brought in some new participants and some new speakers, some completely unknown to us. And that's great. And I hope there might be some way to think about keeping in touch with people. So we've had, I think, over 50 people in most in one session. All sessions have had most over 30 people, and we got involved in a little process with CAL group or committee organizing group, really the same as in previous years, though I haven't been on one for a while, but obviously it's been a bit different this year, and we will be reflecting on what's worked, what hasn't worked. As you'll have seen, there's quite a lot. There's been a fair number of channels. Some have been used more than others. We went with Adobe and Teams, and a big thanks to Vicky. I think your scavenger hunts, Vicky, got us going to a really good start and encouraged us to discover and explore different spaces. So I've learned things about Adobe through that, and I see that Rebecca has put up Katie Jordan's visualization of the genealogy, I can hardly say it at the moment, CALRG. Thank you so much, Katie and Rebecca, for giving it to us. Okay, so we've explored different spaces, and I think we've had a really good coverage of topics, and also a lot of coherence. So it's quite interesting getting both at once. So we've had very current issues, such as researching during COVID, and excellent keynotes. So the first one from Vanessa on social AI, and we couldn't record that, but you can always look her up, Vanessa Evers. And that started also a thread where old in the sense of not been here for a while, rather than old, friends have come and joined us as well. So people have been part of the CALRG and have left. And it was great to see Vanessa, who was a student here, and I hadn't seen her for quite a long time, and really good to catch up with what she was doing. And she was talking to us about social AI. And that AI theme continued because we had on yesterday, and I've just put down the program somewhere, we carried on with that. Sorry, you just lost me as I looked for it. Adaptive Tau, and we had Selena telling us about AI augmenting the OU student journey. And the interesting thing about something like AI is that it was an original theme and issue in the CALRG back in 1979. So, you know, there's this notion of things that persist through time as well as what changes. And then thinking about what changes, but what connects with it, our second keynote was Charles Crook, who's also had a long time association with us at the OU. And his talk on recorded on lectures was, again, a really good prompt, I think, for us to think about all kinds of things. So he talked about the video lecture. And that got us thinking about a number of issues, and was both very practical and empirical and theoretical. That's three, isn't it? So that can't be both. But never mind. So, and in talking about continuity as well, it was really good to see recent student talks using eye tracking, because I remember when we set up the lab for doing that, and that was quite a long time ago. And then there was a little pause when that wasn't used so much. So that was really good to see Irina's work on that. And somebody else was using tracking as well, weren't they? So we had 2 book launches, and I think they also illustrate the kind of continuity throughout and how things change. So Martin Weller, in his 25 years of ed tech, had to deal with, you know, people saying at various points, essentially, that online learning was invented many years after it had already been going for quite a long time. And that book which is just called 25 Years of Ed Tech, or something very similar, is available freely. And yesterday we talked about the other book, which is Educational Visions, Learning from 40 Years of Innovation, and that's edited by myself, Eileen and Rebecca, but has chapters by very many CALRG members and contributors. So, and that's also freely available. And I think both emphasize how EdTech research and practice builds on existing research to go forwards. It's not something new that just appears, as you sometimes get the impression. So I don't want to be too long, but the fact that everything nearly has been recorded means you can revisit much if you want to do that. We are going to be thinking about what we've learned from this event, what worked well, how we might want to do things in the future. And I'm wondering what we'll want to do when we are allowed to go face-to-face again, because there are clearly advantages of both. But it would be a bit tough on resources to try and do both. So that's something for us to think about. What else did I want to say? I guess, last but absolutely not least, a very, very big thank you to all presenters, participants, the organising group, and and keeping it going. I've really enjoyed it and hope everybody else has too. So I am going to end on that note. Unless anybody else has something very pressing to say.
I'm going to jump in here because we've had a couple of questions come through since I posted the plug for the ethics workshop. Tomorrow, the last event is an interactive.
Oh, I forgot.
Workshop.
Sorry, Vicky. I completely lost it there. Yes, we're not completely finished. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, the intention is, unlike most of the events that come,
and that's going to be in this space, right?
Yes, it'll be in this space. It'll be a very different format, which is why we have been tentative about the number of participants that we've invited. And if you look on the program, it says it's invite only. But the idea is to have an interactive workshop with some group activities. Part of a project that Eileen Scanlon and Shaylee Minosh and I have been working on is to have a look at what ethical considerations are important across educational technologies. While I said it's invite only, we do have some spaces free. So if anybody here would like to join, please feel free to come along. As I said, it'll be about a 2-hour workshop. Most of it is going to be facilitated group discussion. If you've ever been to an evidence cafe, it's going to be very similar to that kind of style, where you have maybe a worksheet or something that you will collaboratively fill in with your group. So please feel free to come along. Just 9:30, come along to the same link you've been using all the way through the CALRG conference. It starts at...
And I'm going to say something I forgot when you finish.
Pardon? Right.
I'm going to say something I forgot because I'm a forgetful person, which is that we did gather information about where our participants came. And so we've got people from the USA, from Canada, Singapore, South Africa, Indonesia, Turkey, Sweden, Belgium, Australia. And so 43 out of our 99 people are external. So that's really, really great. And we've got quite a few universities in the UK represented as well amongst our participants. So that's a very great place to have got to. And for those of you who are able to go along tomorrow, I'm not sure I can, have a good morning tomorrow. Otherwise, we should probably say goodbye and draw to an end.